beat in the story was the length of a tweet. They would start it up every night, and they would, put these tweets out, one every 2 or 3 minutes, and they were gorgeous, these like little crystal gems. But the fact that they were so good in some ways betrayed their origin. They felt like prose that had been written, long ago and far away. They didn't feel sort of native to Twitter. So in fact, if you missed it live on Twitter, it was almost more fun and more coherent to just read it in order on the New Yorker site. So this is one data point. Like, it succeeded as a story, certainly, and it succeeded as beautiful language, but it didn't really feel native to Twitter. To find something that feels like fiction built for Twitter, we're going to have to look somewhere else. So, of course, there's nothing more native to Twitter than the celebrity impersonation account. These great satirical accounts, there's like 10 new ones every day, and they succeed or fail on character, on voice. They work if someone can establish and then consistently bring back this voice on Twitter in the form of tweets. So Not Tilda Swinton was the latest big success. These are literally the first 2 tweets from this account, and they were not long ago. And you can see by the second tweet, darkness falls, I sit on my throne of bone and await the evening's offering. My bat servant Theramaya returns to roost. Like, there's already a whole world here. You're like, tell me more. This is not just a satire, it's like a fictional universe they've created. So this all happened in the course of a week. They're sort of building this day by day. I think this is probably my favorite one from the whole week. A mission for you. Go outside, hold an animal to your breast. That is real warmth, not the glow of your screen. I typed this on a rabbit. So this is great. And they were rewarded for their efforts. They got like 30,000 followers in a whole week, but then they were trapped. And when they wanted to basically get credit for their brilliance, to sort of sign their work, everybody went, oh, that's boring, that's so lame. They took the mask off and they kind of got punished for it. So this is cool, it's a cool format, but it kind of sucks that you can only sort of, wear the mask. You can't be a whole person on Twitter. You can't be a whole storyteller. So we need to look somewhere else. So immodestly, I'm going to tell you about some of the stuff that I have been doing on Twitter, because I'm interested in this, and I try to experiment with this stuff. One of the things that I love most on Twitter is big events, and this is what Twitter is really good at. When people are doing something together, they tweet about it, like the tweets from BEA here are awesome. And in my neck of the woods, the Bay Area, there was a big story recently and a big news event that everyone was paying attention to, which was the Facebook IPO. And in fact, they were kind of waiting at their computers. Frankly, they were bored. We were all kind of waiting for the stock to get listed and to see what would happen. So I started tweeting as if I was participating in the Facebook IPO in 1,000 years. Not Facebook, but Fatebook. And this is cool. This is, especially for a writer, this is very appealing because there's essentially this surplus of attention. People are already paying attention to the event, and so you can kind of inject this fictional strand. You can type things like, Lord Zuck takes the stage. His hoodie just keeps growing. Now it's long and dark with a wide cowl. It looks like an emperor's robe. And you can create this sort of refracted fictional version of something that people are really interested in. Also in the Bay Area, the Golden Gate Bridge turned 75, and people were actually like tweeting like crazy about that. They were tweeting like history of San Francisco and the Golden Gate Bridge. So I inserted some fictional facts, like the fact that it can transform into a giant battle robot to defend San Francisco from danger. And what you can see me doing here is actually something where I'm trying to define a format that will set these up as like the fictional tweets. Because remember, everything on Twitter, fiction included, shares the timeline with everything else. It's this big mix of stuff. Some of it's serious, some of it's silly, some of it real, some of it made up. And so these fun facts, which of course were neither fun or actually facts, kind of gave the flag like, hey, I'm doing something over here. If you're following along the storyline, this is where to look. But the person who's mastered this sense of format more than anyone else, I've got to actually give some credit here to my friend Andrew Fitzgerald, who's in the audience. He works at Twitter, and he told me about this guy, and he told me what he was up to, and he explained why it was so great. So I'm basically just regurgitating what I heard from him. The person who has mastered this more than anyone else is a writer named Teju Cole. This is a guy who's the author of the book Open City, which was super acclaimed. It's a book set here in New York City. And he has pioneered a format, a way of tweeting that he's been sort of practicing for many months now that he calls small fates. So what is a small fate? Small fate looks something like this. Having left an elegant note informing his landlord he was Austrian nobility, Fleinschauer of East 8th Street turned on the gas. It's a tiny obituary. Now, this is actually true. All of Teju Cole's small fates are drawn from newspaper reports from 100 years ago, and he kind of rewrites them for Twitter. But I think the insight that he's giving us here can apply to any kind of work on Twitter, fiction included. So what is that insight? The insight is these are all small fates. And you can tell just by looking at them. They don't have a hashtag that says hashtag small fates. There's nothing that says, okay, time for another small fate. It's just the language, but something about the structure, the rhythm, the tone, it's like a signature. You just know immediately, oh, it's another one of his small fates. You know, those are so interesting. And even when he mixes them in with other stuff, you know, he gets to be a whole person on Twitter. He gets to like post YouTube videos and post links and post snarky quips just like everybody else. But then he gets to deploy this tool. I think of it almost as a technology. He invented this thing, the small fate, and so he gets to use it whenever he wants. So I think the takeaway from these 4 examples kind of taken together is that language is the coin of the realm. You know, without good language, you sort of don't get anywhere. Character and timing are native to Twitter, and they're really important to consider. But I think it's format. I think it's these sort of interesting, identifiable formats that's going to be the future of fiction on Twitter. And again, it kind of brings us back to this why. You know, like why should we even think about this or kind of look at these examples? And I think the reason is, again, not that Twitter is the shiny new thing, and not even because Twitter is the cool thing. It's because fiction is the cool thing. And it turns out that fiction might have a home in this place. Teju said the most exciting thing about Twitter is that we don't know what it is yet. And we don't know what fiction on Twitter yet is either. So let's keep inventing.
Okay, so like a lot of you, I was a huge fan of Nick Harkaway's first book, Gone Away World. And when his second book came out, Angel Maker, there was this sort of rush on social media to talk about how there was a code embedded in the cover of the book, which was so cool. I'd never really seen anything like it. I'm definitely not smart enough to crack the code, but I am smart enough to meet the person who wrote the code. So I'd like to introduce Jason Boer. Jason is a cover designer at Alfred A. Knopf. He teaches at Parson, and he works with his wife, Helen Yentis, as a design team, Yentis and Boer. Lately, he's interested in making games and experiences at Interval Studios. Jason?
Okay, hello. Hello. All right. So I'm going to talk to you about the code that I developed for Nick Harkaway's new novel, Angel Maker. And one of the big parts of my job as a cover designer is to find the thing that's unique or special about each and every title I work on and then translate that into the jacket. And one way to do this is to find something that's interesting personally. And it doesn't always work, because it's not about me, it's about the book. But very often, if you find something that speaks to you in the book and then find a way to get close to it, you have the chance to create a design that has a soul. And that just means it's unique. And that's one of the most important things, I think, about a successful book package. And so for me, with Angel Maker, it was the code. I mean, the code represents a lot of things to the book and connects to them in this super spy diesel punk world filled with mad scientists and London gangsters and things like that. But so when I was in 3rd grade, I was lucky enough to get taken out of class every week to do this problem solving with a special teacher for an hour, and there were games and puzzles, and this is one of the ones I actually remember the most. This visual pun, and the thing about it, I think about codes this way as a puzzle, as a game, and the thing when you solve them, there's something meaningful. You get something from it, and it's rewarding. And I also think about codes as being potentially intimate. I spent a summer of my college during my college. Exchanging encrypted letters with my girlfriend at the time, and it took a long time to decode each letter and to translate the whole thing, and even longer to write. And the messages were more they were more special because of this involvement, because of this engagement. And you can actually read this way, and it's how I used to read. My first degree was in English, and in writing my thesis on Thomas Pynchon, I found the other letter in his novel V. It was really exciting. One of the characters wears a Mary medallion or a miraculous medal, and it has an M on it. And so all these V's throughout the whole book. There's also a lot of M's, and it was this key that allowed me to see this other world and get really excited about it. And this kind of engagement I'm talking about, Frank Rose speaks more clearly about in his book, The Art of Immersion. And he talks about these worlds that are created around products that invite users or readers to move into or engage or immerse themselves actively. And the important thing in this social media world about these is he talks about them as storytelling, not just tricks. They deepen the experience. So I read this book about a year before I worked on Angel Maker. And this is an early stage of the design. And so Angel Maker refers to a mechanical doomsday device that it offers not a violent end, but a soft one that involves brainwaves and mechanical bees. And it's that kind of book. But I didn't know what those discs were going to be. I was really happy with it. But then I thought, what if it's a code? What if we put a secret message on the front, and that leads you to a website that has a clue, and enhanced content leads you back to the book, and so on until you get somewhere. And so I tried it, and I thought, well, what is the code going to be? What is it going to look like? And I thought, well, I wanted it to be a combination of old computer punch cards and clockwork, not just the gears, but also the clock face and the computers in the book. And so this is what I came up with. It's a disk that has segments, 12 on the outside and 6 in the middle, and you could punch them out, and this is the alphabet. And I did it. I put it on the cover, I pitched the idea of the code, and it was approved. But the thing I was the least happy or most unhappy about this whole thing, there was no reason that symbol meant A. And there was a lack of elegance. So I had to find a connection between time and the alphabet, and there is one, but I didn't know it at the time. Time zones are lettered. They have been for a few hundred years, starting with Z in Greenwich time. And so it gave me a way to map the alphabet onto a clock face. And so here's the basic system of the code. And the easy way to understand this is if it's 12 o'clock in London, which is in the Z time zone, it's 1 o'clock in France, which is in the A time zone. So there's the A symbol. But it's also 1 o'clock in Honolulu, which is in time zone X. And that's where the inner segments come into play. They indicate the opposite side of the world letter for the other time zone. And so it allowed for the putting a whole word inside of one symbol, one disk, which was great. And so I gave you, the disk gives you the letters, and you have to unscramble them and figure out the world. But it was a little sloppy, and is it cat, is it act? And we figured out a way to indicate the first letter by taking out the outer ring of the first letter in the word, and it solved a lot of the problems of this kind of repetition. And so it was pretty exciting. And as you can probably imagine, there's a lot of other issues, repeated letters. What if I want to use the same letter from the same time slot, both of them like pi? And I solved them all. And in the end, what we had was a tight, complex, but meaningful way of encrypting language. And it allowed for a bigger secret message on the front, but that Nick got to write. But the thing that solved for me, the biggest problem that solved for me, was the potential for this whole thing to be cheap. If my wild dreams didn't come true of what this would get you in the end if you followed this whole trail, which they didn't, at least the experience or the intimacy or the engagement in the code itself was rewarding enough. So we did it. We put the code in the front. We had a campaign where we embedded this code in blog posts and author videos and different places before the pub date. And then we put codes on the clues on the jackets to be able to solve the code. And we had the websites. And on the websites, the enhanced content was recordings of one character leaving love letters for another character hidden inside of jazz records. And it was exciting. But the thing I really wanted in the end was for you to end up in a place where it was a digital night market. And this is from the book. There's a night market where the London underworld met. And the only way you could get there was to decode the secret location, because it was in a different place every time, from the wanted ads of the newspaper. And so what I wanted was a digital version of that where whoever went through this got to leave messages in code and read messages that other people were leaving in the code. But we didn't have the budget for that program. I don't know. But, if nothing else came from this campaign and the code and the time spent from everybody at Knopf working on it, other than the association of Nick Harkaway as an author with something so interesting and special, then it was worth it, because he is interesting and special. He has that in him, and so you should read him, and that's the Angel Maker code. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Next up, we have Dan Wilbur. And Dan is a stand-up comedian, bookseller at Community Bookstore in Park Slope, and creator of the blog Better Book Titles. His first book, How Not to Read, Harnessing the Power of Literature-Free Life. It's a bold title. Will be published by Perigee on September 4th. Dan.
Distinguished guests, friends, people who are wondering why a hungover Justin Bieber just got on stage. I run a literary humor Tumblr called Better Book Titles, hell-bent on summarizing every book ever written. And this is Animal Farm by George Orwell. Just to get this out of the way, I wrote a book. It's called How Not to Read. It helps you wean yourself off the addiction of reading, which I think we could all use. Just wanted to get it out of the way. I won't mention it again. So this blog, I wanted to tell students and young people what the content of books were. So I started with something like Hamlet, which I called Ghost Dad, which is a book. It's a movie, an obscure reference to a Bill Cosby film, so this is a joke for everyone and no one. But what about what readers are going to get into when they start reading a book? We have Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway, I have a blurb from the original back cover. After reading Dalloway, I came to the realization that I've spent 20 years married to the wrong man. But on a lighter note, there's definitely no God. Thank you, Virginia. The New York Times. What about books that students feel that they have nothing in common with, like James Joyce's Ulysses? Well, I tried to get young people involved by when I was young, I had the Book It program from Pizza Hut, where they gave you pizza for reading books. But I think if we told kids that the pinnacle of modernist literature was about giving handskis to sailors, I think more people would read. And what about contemporary literature? What about books like The Marriage Plot? I found a blurb. Here's a blurb. A thorough mix of Hemingway and Plath, in that after finishing it, I wanted to kill myself. Oprah said that. Isn't that weird? Oprah Winfrey. Did I mention that I wrote a book? It helps you wean yourself off reading. How often have you come home, just want to unwind with a few pages of Kafka, and then an hour later you find yourself naked in a park 600 pages into a DeLillo novel? We've all been there. This book will help you stop that. It also has great tips for reading and writing better and dealing with literary culture. I wanted to give kids a chance to understand the moral points that they might be missing from books. Here's F. Scott Fitzgerald, Great Gatsby. Just a good PSA for kids if they're not going to read the books. And what about kids' self-esteem? We all worry about that. So I have Eric Carl's The Very Hungry Caterpillar. Thank you, Eric, for inspiring me to overeat so that I, too, can become a butterfly with the torso of a plastic bag stuffed with leaves. That would be great. Speaking of teaching kids good moral traits, here is I Want My Hat Back. I Want My Hat Back. Great moral lessons for children, because children are all psychotic, twisted sociopaths who would kill each other if it weren't for us giving them books like this. And what about other beloved children's titles with great moral lessons, like Roald Dahl's James and the Giant Peach? Roald Dahl, of course, the author of A Bunch of Kids Visit the Kid-Killing Factory and the prequel to Carrie, otherwise known as Matilda. It's never too early to teach kids this. This is Howard Zinn's book. Now, what about book covers that'll tell you more about the person who's reading that book? I came up with a book cover for a very popular book. It's getting a lot of attention, called 50 Shades of Grey. What does it say about the person who's reading it on the subway or the bus? Let's take a look. There it is. Why does this book Why is every paragraph in this book punctuated with an italicized fuck, one sentence? Did Lewis Black write this book? That's all I want to say about this thing. And what about other books that we don't know what the outside is, what the reader is really going through? Sorry, I flubbed that. This is the girl with the dragon tattoo. After I started this blog, I had a lot of reader submissions, and I had a couple just really great ones I wanted to show you because I think they're much better than anything else that I've come up with. And here they are. It's To Kill a Mockingbird and The Fountainhead. Of course, one of them is the one that you would never want to give to kids. You'd never give them because they'd be self-righteous, self-involved jerks by the time they're adults. And the other one's The Fountainhead. So, right? Okay. You know, all this talk about other books got me reminded that I'm putting a book out with Penguin, with Perigee. It's called How Not to Read, and it has tons of advice that you can use. Like if a nerd ever insults you, you can come back with this bookish insult. Oh yeah? Your mama's so fat, her Dewey Decimal number must be in the 521s. For celestial mechanics, oh! I haven't seen a face this ugly since Perseus killed the Kraken. All right. Listen, if you're not getting any of these jokes, you need to read more, all right? How about a shrunken white insult? You're about as weak as a passive sentence written in the negative form and probably not considered by anyone to be worth more than an adverb. That's right, shrunken white. You heard it here first. And last, probably. As you can see, the book's getting a lot of attention. And I've come up with some better book titles for my own book. The Secret, but with more jokes about drugs and poop. And Dan got fat since high school, so I bought this book because I felt bad for him. I hate you for laughing at that. Anyway, since I have 21 seconds of your time, my book's coming out on September 4th with Perigee. It's going to be great. It's called How Not to Read. It's full of great information on never reading again. It's the last book you'll ever read, and there's a blurb on the back that says, if you read one book this year, you're like everyone I know. Read this one. Bye!
I would just like to point out that if Ryan and I had realized you could swear, our intros would have been a lot different. So there's that. I'm really excited to bring up our next presenter. I came up with this idea that we would introduce everybody on stage with songs, but then Ryan said that was lame because I wanted to introduce everyone with a Hall & Oates song, and apparently that's dorky. But Sheila Heti would totally get Heart's Barracuda if she was going to walk up on stage to some music. So I'm really excited for her to talk about her upcoming book, which I loved. So let me do a little bio for her. Sheila Heti works as interviews editor at The Believer and has contributed to many interviews with writers and artists to the magazine. She is the author of 5 books, including the upcoming How Should a Person Be?, published this month by Henry Holt. Sheila.
Okay. In the summer of 2006, I was at a writer's retreat in Spain, infatuated with a guy back home who I'd recently started dating, who asked me early on whether I could cook. I knew what the right answer was, and I gave it. Then I spent the entire retreat taking pictures of every single dish the 2 Spanish women prepared for us, hoping in this way to teach myself how to cook. After 2 weeks, it began to dawn on me that photographing food would not teach me how to prepare it. Our passionate orgy was doomed to failure the moment he met a woman who really could cook. And this quote from John Donne became my desktop wallpaper and solace. Art is the most passionate orgy within a man's grasp. Well, we would see whether that was true, wouldn't we? I would replace one orgy with another. This lecture is about how I wrote my book, How Should a Person Be?, which my publishers are calling a novel from life. In this talk, I hope to approach the question, how does one write a novel from life? Here's more desktop wallpaper from that time. Art is the man that will save me. First, I think a novel from life has to take on the role not of a project, but of something commonly native to life, such as a child or a man who will save you. To write a novel from life, you cannot just start typing, you have to go out into the world. Those cue cards were my book in its earliest stages. I wrote questions on them or thoughts, and whenever I'd leave the house, I'd take them with me, like I would with a man. It was like we were talking to each other. Walking down the street, I'd read one that maybe said, "What can the drunk teach us about beauty?" I'd walk around with that in my mind, and it made everything look new. My city began to feel like a book. A few months before, my novel Tickner had come out, and the Village Voice said missing Tickner would be like missing pistachios. Out of pity for my book and pistachios, it soon became my very favorite flavor. I always ordered it. But I thought maybe they were right. I'd always thought of making art as an offering to the art gods or something. I never imagined that a book was something that you made for people. So if a reader felt like it was like a pistachio, I could sort of understand why. I think to make art for people, you have to be more like a pea among peas than a butterfly in its cocoon. Creating from a cocoon in your room, alone in your solitude, is sort of the modernist ideal, and I had done that, and it was really life-sucking. So I thought with this novel from life, maybe I wouldn't have to be in my room. Maybe the writer from life gets to forgo a room. The whole world becomes the room, or she has no room. In fact, I'd recently become friends with this painter, Margot Williamson, and I was so excited by her, and the thought of sitting in my room instead of going out with her was just grotesque to me. In my imagination, it was just telling me one thing: go see Margot. I sometimes tried to get it to create characters for me, but then the next morning I'd wake up and I couldn't care about them at all. So this is something Margot said: we are not experts, we are believers. She had faith that to make art you had to use what was around you and believe in the sufficiency of what was there, not go searching for the best materials or narrative. I decided I'd not look up any facts on the internet while writing the book. I would use my brain as the way it was. That way the book would become life-size and be like a person, sometimes dumb and sometimes wrong. This is Flaubert. James Wood said that since Madame Bovary, novelists have all done kind of the same thing, adopting its innovations, like the prose would detail the visual world exclusively, or the text would maintain an unsentimental composure. I was totally sick of novels at the time. I couldn't stand reading them, and I wondered if I did the opposite of all those things, what would result? So my book would document the oral world. I'd write down what people said around me instead of what things look like. And the prose would lose its composure. It would be emotional, like a person, like I was. And all of this matched Margot's aesthetic. She was not tight and controlled when she worked. She felt messiness was really important, and I longed to be as messy as a painter who paints. This is Margot again. Her mother told a story to me once about when Margot was a baby, and it took her a really long time to talk. And one day her mother's friend was discussing a self-help book in which whatever problem you came across, you were just supposed to say, "Who cares?" That night, Margot's sister spilled milk all across the table, and everyone started getting upset, and the sister was crying, and Margot's first words came, "Who cares?" That was the kind of person I wanted to be friends with. This is the Pioneer plaque, which was on a spacecraft in the early 70s. It wanted to communicate to aliens the most important things about us, like that men are friendly, I guess. The thing that moves me about this is not that it succeeds in any way. I'm sure no alien would get it at all, but how sincerely it's trying to communicate and how artlessly. The plaque didn't care about art, it cared about the aliens. I loved that. So this is kind of one of the models I made for my book. The yellow circle represented culture, which was like a room with the lights going on and off, and I saw the blue line as the soul, and sometimes they would sort of interact, and the black marks were scenes in the book, moments in time. You know, writing a novel from life, it just has to be a model. It can't be life itself. And I sort of wondered, was my model true? But then I realized, who cares? Is a sausage true? The important thing is that it just hangs together. Because that's the most notable thing about life, is that the illusion never breaks, except with deja vu. But otherwise, pretty good job. I did what desperate writers do. I put my plan on the wall. There's nothing really to say about that, just that the wall is the best place to put one's thoughts. Because the walls of your room are like the inside of your skull. If you put your thoughts on the wall, then your brain grows to fill the whole room. At least that's what I think happens. Ancient Rome, the goddess Fortuna, she was embossed on all the coins to remind people of the role that chance plays in life. It was a warning against hubris. The coins serve not just a monetary purpose, but a moral one. The coins represent what I thought a novel should be. It should try and save us. It should be symbolic, simple, close at hand, easy to grasp, like one of those chicken legs. My book, How Should a Person Be, was published in Canada originally in 2010. Later, I found a publisher here, Henry Holt. And in that time, my life had changed. My understandings had deepened, things had occurred, yet the book stayed fixed in time. It lagged behind me. It would have felt weird to publish that same version, so I rewrote it until I felt it had caught up with my life and my brain. Now, the book is being published, I guess, on the 19th of this month, and I wouldn't rewrite it again. You do have to let things end in life. But I realized that the easiest romantic relationships to move on from are the ones where you went to the absolute end with a person, not drop things in the middle. The abandoned relationships haunt you forever. And I think the same holds true for artistic projects, so I'm always trying to go to the very end because I hate being haunted. My favorite painter has long been Manet, who was a contemporary of Flaubert's. People said his art was ugly and his subject matter debased. I always found his aesthetic so mysterious and wanted to know what he knew. I ended up instead learning from a painter 2 blocks from my home, whose values turned out to be so much like his, that ugliness is beautiful, and one's environment is a sufficient model, be loose with your brush, and in the face of all else, who cares? These were the women who cooked our meals. How did they learn to cook? Did they learn from each other? I think photographing their food was a good early practice for writing a book from life, which never sits as still as a plate of peas. Over the last 7 years, I've come to agree that writing a book is not only the most passionate orgy within our grasp, but also the most reliable one. Happy ending. Instead of that guy, I now have this book, and my beloved cooks for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sheila. So next up, we have Nate Silver. Nate Silver is a statistician, writer, and founder of the New York Times political blog 538.com. Silver also developed Pecha, my favorite broadcasting system for baseball, named randomly after a, was it Royals outfielder? Yeah, infielder. It was bought by Baseball Prospectus. He was named one of the world's 100 most influential people by Time Magazine. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, and he has a novel with the Penguin Press this fall. A book, not a novel. It's facts. Okay, Nate Silver, everyone.
Cool. Well, thank you. So writing a book gives you time to kind of slow down a little bit. I write for the New York Times. I write about politics, mostly sports, occasionally. But writing a book gives you a chance to reflect and see, are we thinking about problems in the right way? And this book is about prediction, but really it's about information. Shouldn't the slides have started by now? Or we're supposed to? Oh, okay. Sorry, I was really thrown off. Yeah. There you see it. Okay. We're living in an increasingly information-rich world, and I had experiences in field like baseball, where Moneyball came along when I was active. You saw really a revolution in the way that game was handled, people making much better decisions. Or in politics, where the bar is so low, let's be frank, when you see like the average Politico talk show, that just being somewhat quantitative helps a lot. But as I studied other fields for this book and went and interviewed people who were trying to forecast the economy or trying to forecast how the flu will spread or trying to forecast earthquakes, for example, I found that for the most part, mankind's effort to predict the future has resulted in failure. So the book kind of got a little bit darker as I went along and studied other fields, and this book is my effort to try and reconcile that, the cases where we've seen a lot of progress being made with cases where we haven't so much. And so I call this is maybe the most generic PowerPoint slide ever, but it's the 80-20 rule, where on the one hand, you're putting a certain amount of effort into a problem. On the other hand, how good your forecasts are, how accurate you are, will change over time. So in fields like baseball, people were doing things wrong, just looking at some numbers, knowing that, as Billy Beane found out, on base percentage is more reliable than batting average. That can get you a long way. But in other fields, the water level is much higher, and you really have to make every effort to think more deeply about what you're doing, think more deeply about prediction, and it requires sometimes embracing truths that are uncomfortable. And we're going to talk about that for the rest of the presentation. But people expect to read books that are kind of self-help guides, or they expect to read books that are ways to get rich quick, and that's not how the real world works. If things were easy, then people would already be doing them. So this book is looking at reasons why our judgment is sometimes flawed. Let me give you one more example. One reason why I grew a little bit more skeptical about the idea that you can just take a bunch of data and put it in a computer and churn magic out of it is because before I started writing about politics, I went through a phase where I played poker for a while, for a living, and I thought it was really good. It was 2003, and this guy named Chris Moneymaker, who was kind of this fat accountant from Nashville, won the World Series of poker. Everyone thought, well, I can just quit my office job and go and make millions of dollars playing poker. And I was one of those people, right? But I had some mathematical abilities, so it was pretty easy, actually. I could sit there on my computer or go to the casino and kind of, use some common sense and, not pretend I could read everyone's hands, but just try and play poker well, and I did pretty well. But what happens is that I'm kind of not really navigating the slides very well here. It turns out that if you actually look at how poker players do, only a very small number of them win money, and once the bad ones go broke, then people who thought they were winners before wind up being losers. I was one of the people that used to be a winner at poker until everyone else realized, like, hey, it's not very fun to sit here and lose, $500 an hour constantly, and so that changed the whole ecology of the environment. The line between success and failure when you're working with numbers and data and statistics is often very thin. You're not usually that much smarter than anyone else. Instead, it's more about having good habits and good practices that allow you to sustain success. One of those is understanding that when we try and forecast the future, we're dealing with uncertainty. The present occurs to us in the here and now. It comes to us in shades of black and white. Something either happens or it doesn't. That leads us to misperceive sometimes how much uncertainty there really is when we look at the future, when we don't know the future with perfect certainty, or the past for that matter. When I issue a forecast like for the New York Times, we have a range of outcomes. It's not an error, it's the fact that we can't plausibly know everything that's going to happen, so knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know winds up being the key, I think, to making more accurate predictions. It's not about saying I can call a coin flip right 100% of the time when you can't. Sometimes it's a whole deal, in fact. We tell a story in the book about when the National Weather Service issued a flood forecast in North Dakota. The Red River was flooding. People of Grand Forks were worried. The Weather Service said, however, it'll only flood to 49 feet, we think, and the levee is 51 feet, right? This is the forecast they issued. So the people said, well, what's the big deal? What the Weather Service forgot to tell them is that the margin of error on their forecast was plus or minus 9 feet, meaning that there was almost a 50-50 chance that there would be a major flood. As there was, it was just a little bit worse than they thought, but the entire town literally was flooded. 75% of the buildings there were destroyed. It was a preventable disaster. You can reinforce a levee with sandbags and so forth. And so being willing to express what we don't know is often as important as saying what we do know. It's also important when you're dealing with a difficult problem to use both the statistical evidence and whatever judgment you might apply. So I went back and looked at the baseball predictions that my system called Pacoda had made 6 years earlier and compared them to what scouts had done, and I was kind of hoping that my system would win. But it turned out that kind of contra Moneyball, the scouts actually did a little bit better. The list they produced was about 15% more accurate. That translates into millions of additional dollars worth of value they're generating. And the reason why is because they start with the stats now, they're smarter and smarter, and they add their judgment on top of that. So, we don't want to be dogmatic about saying, oh, numbers can solve anything, or, oh, we need to have our judgment. We need really people who can combine the best of both worlds, and that is hard. It requires experience. That's why this book tells a lot of stories from real-world fields in which people are doing this either successfully or not. It's also important to remember that even when you make a great forecast, it doesn't do any good if no one listens to it. One real success story we give in the book is about hurricane models. People think weather forecasters are terrible. They're like the heroes of the book, in fact. 20 years ago, if you're trying to predict where a hurricane would go, you had a 350-mile radius, which is the average error. So anywhere you have a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, anywhere from Houston to Tallahassee, it might end up. Now you can get within about 100 miles 3 days in advance. The Weather Service did, in advance of Katrina, warned the mayor of New Orleans to evacuate, and of course, he didn't listen. It took him an extra 24 hours to evacuate. A lot of people didn't listen. They were used to bad forecasts like what you see on TV. So the Weather Service has learned it's very important to communicate exactly what you know and what you don't know. It's part of a scientific forecast. And another reason why we have to know what we don't know is because sometimes the threats that are most existential to us are cases where there are things that are in the back of our heads that we don't even really think about very much. In advance of Pearl Harbor, we had naval stations at Midway Islands and in Alaska and Hawaii, wherever else, right? So we thought, well, we have radio coverage of these areas. Nothing can penetrate that, right? Except there was a blind spot right in the middle of those defenses where, when we weren't looking, the Japanese naval fleet came through in about 2 weeks and wound up taking a right turn to Hawaii and bobbing Pearl Harbor, and it surprised us. We hadn't even considered the idea that Japan was going to attack Pearl Harbor at that time. We had different theories, and so we didn't look at the evidence in the right way. Likewise, we talked to Donald Rumsfeld in the book before September 11th. We didn't even think about the idea that terrorists could take planes and ram them into buildings, and so it wasn't like we were even making a rational assessment so much as that we weren't expanding our minds enough and looking at the different hypotheses in the world enough to really understand all the possibilities and how they could occur. So sorry, this has been a talk compressed into a very short period of time, but we're really excited about the book. It's really richly illustrated with stories from people I've talked to in these fields. It tells you something about how to actually get better at taking all this information in the world and finding real meaning from it. So thank you.
So the secret of 7x20x21 is that you can cheat if you write for the New York Times. We try to cut in, but we let it happen. So I'm going to introduce our last presenter, and then we will have a cocktail hour here. So I would recommend everyone stay and buy drinks for people who have entertained you, maybe including the hosts. I don't know. You decide. So our last presenter is D.T. Max. He's a graduate of Harvard University and a staff writer for The New Yorker. He's the author of The Family That Couldn't Sleep, a medical mystery, and he'll be talking about his new David Foster Wallace biography.
All right, I have to find the space bar first, and then we'll be on the way. But I realize if I don't hit the space bar, you can go on forever, right? All right, let's start. All right, David Foster Wallace, a figure, I think, at this point of extraordinary interest in the culture. You probably, or at least many of you know, the basic facts that he died by his own hand in 2008. That's an important part of David's life, but I think one of the things you really have to try when you write a biography of somebody who's had a life that ends in such a sad way is trying to get away from that moment. You're going to be looking at a bunch of slides that are actually the kind of things that a biographer has to consider. So when you take a look at this, this is a poem that David wrote when I think he was, I don't know, he was 7 or 8. And one of the peculiar things about David, and I think it connects to everything that's going on today, is that he has somehow, in a way that I try to get at in the book, and I think people are trying to get at every day on the web, he's somehow connected to the way we are today as people. There's an interesting way in which David, after, as a writer, he was celebrated for sure. As a writer, his book Infinite Jest was, one of the great books of the 1990s, and for many readers, actually the seminal novel of their lifetime. That's the one he wrote. It's actually one I love that he dismissed as being written by a clever 7-year-old, but we should all be such clever 7-year-olds. Anyway, the way in which David connects to all of us, I think, is one of the most sort of complicated and fraught and exciting things about David. And one of the things that I think I spend a lot of time working on in the book is the question of how a writer really captures his time. And David, in a funny way, even with the publication of Infinite Jest in 1996, it was palpable that he had in some way begun to think about who we are. And a lot of what's interesting about Infinite Jest is it's also predictive. It actually, much of it takes place in 2009. And so in a lot of ways, we're living now in the era that David had imagined. This is a slide of somebody put together a kind of real-life model of what the academy where much of David's work, much of Infinite Jest takes place. It's an actual sort of drawing of what it would have looked like in Boston or in Brighton, actually. But anyway, with David, I think what we're grabbing onto, both as a biographer but also as a reader who's just interested in his work, is some sense in which our culture is changing and in which we are following the kind of suggestions that he laid down for us. I think there's a funny way in which, even though Infinite Jest is really about the addictive power of video or video cassettes and TV, what he's really talking about in a lot of ways was the computer age. All the things that we've talked about here in this conference, from tweeting, how do you tweet a novel? I mean, these would be concepts that for David would be incredibly interesting. He was not somebody who rejected modern culture outright, but it was certainly a culture he had a lot of skepticism for. So, when I first wrote about David, I wrote about him for The New Yorker shortly after his death, and I wrote a long piece. It was about 10,000 words long. But I didn't really feel I'd gotten to him. And so it was also so soon after his death, I felt like everything we were writing was really in the shadow of the sad way that he had ended. So I wanted to go back and try to do the whole life, and try to do the whole life without so much sort of foreshadowing of the tragic end. Of course, everyone else has to be the judge of whether I succeeded, but some of these images give you a sense of just how sort of joyous and complicated and fun and peculiar David was, and the way he approached the world. And in a lot of ways, I think you learn more about David if you don't know how it ended. If you only think about the books, if you only think about the work, if you think about the pleasure he took in the work, if you think about his incredible commitment to the work. This is sort of like a yearbook for somebody. We just sort of gathered up some images of David from different times. And I think as a culture, we're still really, in a lot of ways, on our way to understanding who David was. I mean, this biography is a first attempt to try and say, this is a person, this is a writer, this is his life, this is his work. But I think our understanding of David is really going to be a work in progress, and we're going to continue to sort of think new thoughts, and I think he's going to continue to be extremely sort of alive and present in relation to the culture. I think much in the way maybe that Salinger was for an earlier generation, or perhaps Joyce feels so far away now that nobody can really take his relationship to the culture seriously, or not seriously, but kind of emphatically. But I think in a lot of ways, that David will continue to evolve, and will continue to evolve in our relationship with David. One thing I'd wanted to mention that I don't think the title of the book, Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, actually comes from something David said and wrote a number of times in his life. Early on, when he was in graduate school, he wrote on a letter to one of his graduate teachers, he wrote, "Every love story is a ghost story," and he credited it to Virginia Woolf on the Merv Griffin show. No one knows, right? So then, weirdly enough, you'd think this would just be one of these little jokes, and you can sort of see how it would probably connect. It probably connects to a story he wrote called Little Expressionless Animals, which is about Jeopardy, that's in the book Girl with Curious Hair. But anyway, this phrase keeps popping up throughout his life, and in fact, in The Pale King, his posthumous book, if you go to the notebooks for The Pale King, you see the same line, every love story is a ghost story, and this time it's credited to Virginia Woolf on the Johnny Carson show. So you're thinking, who is this man? This is the reason I wanted to give the book this title, is like, this is an interesting idea that preoccupied him clearly through a large portion of his life. And then if you go to the actual book, The Pale King, you find that the phrase, every love story is a ghost story, is also in there. And it's also in one of his stories. So, we were talking a little bit earlier about sort of codes and hints, For me, of course, when you really think about what that phrase means, for me, of course, it sort of embodies the act of biography. I mean, what do you do when you write a biography, but you're chasing a ghost? And it reminds me that when Nate put up that slide, which showed the future, kind of like discernible but uncertain, and then the past was clear. And remember how the present was clear, and remember how the past was murky and being forgotten and lost, and unable to be sort of defined. That's very much, I had this kind of, my heart beat when I saw that, and I thought, that's exactly what we biographers do, is like we try to find a way to clarify a time that's slipping ceaselessly and rapidly and endlessly away from us. Thanks.